My name is Ann Garner. I think most of you know me. And along with the planning team, I am excited that you are here for this fourth evening of our LGBTQ Theologies. Through these gatherings, we are building a network of support in the faith community for LGBTQ plus people across the upstate of South Carolina and beyond. Since the fall of 2018, we've gathered people of faith from more than a dozen congregations and those outside of churches to learn, to organize, and to build a better world together. This event was originally planned for mid-May, but in late March, we realized that we would need to postpone, thanks COVID. We moved the date to mid-October and continued to plan. But over the summer, it became evident that an in-person gathering was not meant to be. So here we are with a series virtually for 5 weeks via Zoom, meeting weekly on Tuesday evenings through October 27th. We are grateful that you have shown up, despite the Zoom fatigue that many of us have. While we do miss out on being together in one room, the benefit to this format has been participation from outside of the upstate area. The theme for this series of gatherings is the Bible as an ally. Our goal has been to share with one another the liberating power of the biblical tradition and to equip one another to confront the violent and exclusive uses of the Bible. We have had incredible speakers thus far, and that will definitely be the case tonight. We have received wonderful feedback from the previous sessions, and for that, we are grateful. So now, well, first, there are a few things that I want to share with you as we get started. We are recording these events and they will be posted on our website. So just be aware of that. When you are not speaking, if you could please stay muted so we can keep out background noise and all of that. We ask that you don't take or share photos of the chat window, but please use the chat window to speak with each other as well as a place to put questions for our speakers. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can in our allotted time. During the discussion time, if you will utilize the raise hand feature, that'll help us moderate the discussion because sometimes there are several screens of people we don't necessarily see a physical hand being raised. And also feel free to use the reaction buttons to share encouragement with our speakers. They can be found by moving your cursor to the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you'll see the reaction button there. For the raise hand button, you click on participants and you'll see a blue hand under the list of participants. Finally, our goal in these gatherings is to build community. There are a few things we can do to make that happen. Listen before speaking. Speak with kindness. Respect the sacredness of these gatherings and the people who are a part of them. We hope that this can be a brave space for all who enter. Now I am excited because I get to introduce you to our speakers for tonight, who are my dear friends, Sally and Maria. Reverend Sally Surratt and Reverend Maria Swearingen share life, love, and ministry together at Calvary Baptist Church in Washington, D.C. Together, they serve a community of progressive Christian resistors, contemplatives, and dreamers who keep responding to national and global diseases like white supremacy, war, racism, religious bigotry, and homophobia with the good news of a liberating God who dares to call each of us beloved. Sally and Maria, I'm not sure I can express how happy I am that you are with us tonight. Thank you so much for sharing your beautiful gifts with us. It's all you.
Thank you for having us. It's good to be with you all, and we're grateful for the work that you're doing in the upstate.
Agreed.
Yeah, with
very much so. Yeah. So I maybe say a little bit about sort of what we're kind of hoping to do.
So what we're up to tonight, we're going to take a look at a particular text of scripture from the book of Acts, chapter 8. We'll start by reading that. And then Maria's going to share a sermon with you all on this text. And then after you've had a chance to hear that, we'll pause in the middle section. And in the second, we'll stop and break down a little bit of what it is we're up to, like of what practice we've just enacted together, and why we think that might be particularly important for the church and for the use of the sacred text in the church and in the world. Okay.
Amen.
Amen. All right, well, with that, hear now these words from the book of Acts, chapter 8, verses 26 through 39. Then an angel of the Lord said to Philip, "Get up and go toward the south, to the road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. This is a wilderness road." So he got up and went. Now there was an Ethiopian eunuch, a court official of the Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, in charge of her entire treasury. He had come to Jerusalem to worship and was returning home, seated in his chariot. He was reading the prophet Isaiah. Then the Spirit said to Philip, "Go over to this chariot and join it." So Philip ran up to it and heard him reading the prophet Isaiah. He asked, "Do you understand what you are reading?" He replied, "How can I unless someone guides me?" And he invited Philip to get in and sit beside him. Now the passage of scripture that he was reading was this: "Like a sheep he was led to the slaughter, and like a lamb silent before its shearer, so he does not open his mouth. In his humiliation, justice was denied him. Who can describe his generation? For his life is taken away from the earth." The eunuch asked Philip, "About whom, may I ask you, does the prophet say this? About himself or about someone else?" Then Philip began to speak, and starting with this scripture, he proclaimed to him the good news about Jesus. As they were going along the road, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, "Look, here is to prevent me from being baptized." He commanded the chariot to stop, and both of them, Philip and the eunuch, went down into the water, and Philip baptized him. When they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord snatched Philip away. The eunuch saw him no more and went on his way rejoicing. The word of the Lord.
Even hearing it tonight. This is a wilderness road. You've seen every season of Queer Eye by now, yes? You've seen every season of Queer Eye by now, yes?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, we're definitely well past the window of spoilers, yes? Can we agree upon that collectively? Great. So you've definitely seen season 2, episode 1, right? Yes. You know which episode that is, right? Because they're all cataloged in a deep place in your heart, right? Okay, well, if not, you know I'm talking about the episode with Mama Tammy and her son, Miles, living their best life in Gay, Georgia, population 89. You know I'm talking about Jonathan sashaying through our living rooms, flowing skirt and coordinated crop top, proclaiming, "Yes, queen," like it's an altar call for self-love.
Yes, queen.
Who else is moved by these queer style guides? Proudly strolling into people's lives and homes and worlds and offering a healing, transformative counter vision for toxic masculinity, for heteronormativity, for white supremacy. Who else cried when Mama Tammy, a longtime faithful Christian, talked about what it looked like to ask her Black gay son for forgiveness after she realized that accepting him for who he was the most gospel thing she could possibly do with her life? Even this year, even after these last 4 years, I still think that there's a beautiful revolution bubbling up in America. And visual panoplies like Queer Eye help us see it a little better. See, the collective culture is not just tolerating or accepting queer folk into their predominantly straight space. The collective culture is actually discovering the healing and freedom and possibility that comes from being transformed by the stories, experiences, and perspectives of queer folk, sachets and non-binary outfits alike. The collective culture is getting queerer. Our visions for the future, our policies and boardrooms and drawing boards and wedding photos are getting queerer. And maybe our churches are too. You may think that the story we just read is about an Ethiopian eunuch getting baptized. Yes? About a man who thought he wasn't in God's story, discovering that he, in fact, was right in the middle of God's story. And we'll get to that. But I'm going to press us to look a little farther in today's story, too. I'm going to press us to pay special attention to the baptism that almost gets missed in this story, the baptism of Philip. The baptism of Philip. Because this isn't just a story about an outsider being invited inside. This is a story about the Spirit whisking an insider back outside, about an insider and outsider finding each other, about insides and outsides merging and submerging together in holy water, about outsides and insides becoming one side, about union and intimacy that turned everybody's insides upside down. And as we follow this double-sided baptism, we wrestle with the wall of normalization, the wall that tells us that things like sexuality and gender are supposed to look a certain way, that men who sashay are dangerous and women who kiss other women are destroying the fabric of the family. The wall that tells us that men who've been castrated don't get to read from the scroll of Isaiah. The bodies that are queer and Black don't get to celebrate the beauty of their bodies dancing in living waters. When we find the Ethiopian eunuch enigmatic and unknown, there's lots we learn about him and lots we don't. We never learn his name. That happens a lot. But we do learn that he's a, to put it clearly, castrated male working for the Queen of Ethiopia. So he seems to sit inside this strange realm between both power and invisibility. And when we find him in the book of Acts, he's traveling on this wilderness road and happens to be reading from the ancient prophets. Here's what he comes across and begins to mull over deeply in his heart, mulling over it so much that he's starting to say it out loud. He's starting to say it out loud so much that Philip can hear him. Like a sheep, he was led to the slaughter, and like a lamb silent before its shearer, so he does not open his mouth. In his humiliation, justice was denied him. Who can describe this generation? Who can describe this generation? For his life is taken away from the earth. Well, that's how the writer of Acts describes this text in Isaiah. It turns out if you actually flip to the text from Isaiah, the last part goes something like this. Let's see if you catch the difference. By a perversion of justice, he was taken away. Who could have imagined his future? For he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. I paused dramatically there, so hopefully you heard it. He was cut off. I can't help but imagine the eunuch reading this passage over and over again, slowly, deliberately, intently, where he was cut off from the land of the living, where he was cut off from the land of the living. The eunuch is in a moment both metaphorical and incarnational, and he can't help but say, who is this story about? Is he talking about himself or someone else? And let me tell you, as a queer Christian, this moment rocks me to my core. Because even if this text is quote unquote about Jesus, it is most certainly about the eunuch. Someone who was literally cut off from the land of the living, stricken by a perversion of justice, a man who most likely didn't ask to be castrated, who didn't ask to be understood and interpreted under a certain sexual lens, finds himself in the capital S story, the big story about God and humanity and God's desire for us, a desire that shifts the plates of history toward justice. So what happens when queer folks start finding their stories in the sacred text, in all the sacred texts? What happens when we start saying to our siblings at church, look, I'm in here. My story is in here. As the eunuch unrolls this ancient scroll, I doubt he ever imagined unrolling his own life and being and body along with it. And so the eunuch realizes that all that he thought cut him off from the world was actually what drew him most closely to the very heart of God. And so he says, as we say, now what would keep me from God's full blessing? From baptism. And the answer then, and the answer now is nothing. It's always nothing. Okay, even though that's more than enough to sit with tonight, I want us to keep going. Can we keep going? Because I can't help but imagine something else equally important, not more important. I'm going to leave it at equally important when I take a freeze frame of this moment. I can't help but imagine Philip's face. Slack-jawed, overcome, as he realizes that the Spirit is playing quite a trick on him. Oh my God. What does prevent him from being baptized? Y'all, I mean, it's almost laughable. Here, these early Jewish Christians are struggling to make sense of whether the Spirit will make room for uncircumcised males. And Philip finds himself chasing after the chariot of a castrated man reading from the prophet Isaiah. You know any other stories about a man unrolling the scroll of Isaiah and reading from it aloud? Luke 4, anyone? What does prevent this man from being baptized? His Ethiopianness, his eunuchness, his blackness, his queerness. See, this story is as much about Philip's conversion as it is the eunuch's. This story is as much about Philip's baptism as it is the eunuch's. This is queer baptism completely overturning and reimagining and redefining and recreating a straight catechism, a straight set of statements about what this faith is for, about what it means to be Christian. As the writer of Acts describes it, the eunuch commanded the chariot to stop, and Philip and the eunuch went down in the water together. And I promise y'all, I'm not just going for shock value here, but honestly, this imagery is evocative. Philip chases after this man's chariot, spends the day in deep conversation with him, sinks into a cool pool of water with him. And I don't think I'm overreading to say that there would have been long hugs and held hands as Philip witnesses the eunuch joyfully accepting his full-bodied self. As the eunuch realizes that the prophet Isaiah and the prophet Jesus have accepted his full-bodied self. Can you see Philip at the edge of the water, watching, waiting, wondering? Wade in the water. Wade in the water, Philip. Go ahead. Wade in the water. Something's happening in the water. And when this happens, when Philip chooses to believe in the belovedness of the eunuch, his priorities, his vision, his time and energy and imagination shifts too. He's not looking to build unity with all people. Now stick with me here, y'all. He's not looking to build unity with all people. Instead, he is looking to build union with God's people. The people that God is demanding his disciples pay attention to and chase after and dip into holy water with. I promise you that Philip lost some friends along the way by choosing to sink into this holy water with, if you'll allow me contemporary liberties here, a Black queer man. I promise you that Philip lost some reputation, whatever that means, lost some influence, whatever that means, lost some social standing. Y'all know what that means. But Philip, in choosing to bind himself to this eunuch, unbound himself to other folks in the process. Philip, in choosing a queer baptism, was relinquishing any grip he had on a straight catechism. Philip chose unexpected union over paltry claims of unity. As Mama Tammy stands before her church during their homecoming celebration, and again, it's season 2, episode 1 of Queer Eye, how can I say that I love God, but I can't love the ones who are right there next to me? I would call myself a hypocrite. Okay, so if I'm not being clear with all this talk about an Ethiopian eunuch and a disciple named Philip, let me get right to it. We don't need churches that just let gay people be deacons. We don't need churches that let gay preachers preach. We don't need churches that let trans leaders be ordained. We don't need churches that let queer weddings happen. See, we need churches that want to get in the water too, that want to choose holy union over paltry unity. Churches that believe that the Spirit is ready to baptize their imaginations, convert their dreams for the future, create something they never could have created on their own. We need churches that are ready to be whisked by the Spirit of God and turn their insides upside down. If you're wondering these days how all these massive walls are going to come down, spend some time asking queer folks how they managed the walls inside them and around them. Ask queer folks how they learned to reinterpret these seemingly impassable and unscalable walls with the sheer force of their bodies teaching them to love. Ask queer folks how they moved and tore down and jumped over the walls of misogyny and institutional violence by exclaiming with the thunder of 1,000 whispers, my story is in this book too. See, people shaped by queer baptism start saying things like this. What can a man who sachets his way through life tell me about how deeply bound I am to my masculinity? What if that masculinity is actually unmanaged misogyny? A brewing violence I've been taught to believe is what makes me powerful and worthy and important. What if it's actually making me distant, damaging, incapable of intimacy? What if I could let that go? See, people shaped by queer baptism start saying things like, what can a person who has lost family members over their sexual orientation teach me about letting go of the need to keep everybody at my dinner table happy while I keep shoving the truth I know they need to hear farther and farther down my chest? What can I learn from a queer person who's been rejected by their social network about living courageously and authentically, even if it means losing some folks along the way? See, people shaped by queer baptism start saying things like, what kinds of relationships, what experiences of intimacy and connection might be just around the corner from me? If I could only imagine beyond the boundaries that have been inscribed for me for so long. What kind of love is standing outside my threshold, riding along in a chariot, saying holy words in a holy body in holy ways I've never heard before? People shaped by queer baptism start writing new catechisms, ones that invite courage and honesty, ones that tear down the walls of what's normal and what's not, ones that desire union more than unity, ones that can't wait for the Spirit to whisk them whatever which way that Spirit wills. Ones that are ready to get in holy water with holy bodies that mean to baptize them too.
Thank you. So for those of you who have been with us for the previous sessions, you know how lucky we are to have this incredible person and poet as part of these events. Ashton Michael Lee is a poet, a storyteller, and a content creator from Spartanburg, South Carolina, currently residing in Ohio. Ashton created a healing tool to help folks to think independently called The Student of Life. The series targets critical life lessons through a power thought and storytelling. The Student of Life series can be viewed on Instagram, and I will add the handle into the chat so that you can follow them. Ash?
All right. Hello, hello, hello. All right. So tonight's poem, it's a poem that I wrote actually some weeks ago. And my background, I'm a church baby and Southern Baptist. And so I know all of that. And my grandmother was the first person to really introduce me to God, to the Bible. And as we all know, we're in the middle of a pandemic and church is different. And I was just kind of inspired to write a piece about church and how we will do church, and people like my grandmother, which church is truly her livelihood. And so it's kind of like, how do we move forward? And I'll give you a little history about her in this poem that's called Purple. My grandmother loves to sing. Nanny loves to sing. I mean, she loves to sing the house down. She's really one of the greats from another lifetime. She just came back to sing because it was shut up, chained down, broken, lost at sea. So she sings. She's the one who came up with the songs, the groans and moans. She's the one who found religion because it was similar to how she preached, how she reached the sun. I can always tell when a song gets good to her. Those feet don't seem to bother her as much, and her legs manage to do some kicks. I've seen my grandmother illustrate a king through song. It's quite miraculous to witness. She's the one who made you believe. She's missionary work you don't see. My nanny has been the orientation teacher in the Black church since I could remember. She played a hand in writing the bylaws for our home church. In the Black church, she's a lawmaker. My nanny is a by-the-book person. She doesn't cut corners. She's the true definition of dedication. She loves to sing. But church ain't been church, not like how it used to be. My nanny sings notes. My nanny is from the day of robes. She loves to sing. She's annual choir concerts and every pastoral anniversary. She's your burgundy hymnals and church fan. She's the gospel music alarm when it's time to clean up. She's Sunday dinner and Sunday nap. She's art that can't be recreated. I imagine her spirit trying to adapt to this new world, this new way of church. I imagine her spirit getting worried, trying to reason with a God that's fading. I imagine her spirit repenting over and over. I imagine her spirit preparing for what's beyond. I imagine her spirit excited to experience living in this time. I imagine her spirit thriving, witnessing history. I imagine her spirit sometimes feeling undeserving, but grateful, all in the same. Nanny loves to sing. Thank you.
Thank you. Ash, is this your grandmother who came to the event in May, last May? So I have to tell a quick story.
Yes.
Ash's grandmother came and to one of our previous events, and Shelton towards the end was playing a song, and I don't remember what it was, but all of a sudden this voice from in front of me started singing this hymn, and then it just kind of spread around Spartanburg Methodist Chapel, and it was just this most beautiful experience started by this grandmother of Ash. So it was fun hearing you tell that story because I was thinking of her. So, Sally and Maria.
Well, I'm guessing, it's just a hunch, but maybe you haven't heard the story of Philip and the eunuch that way before. And with that, I wanted to see if we could spend just a minute talking about starting points and how we approach the sacred text and how that's really different than where we started, if you will.
Yeah.
We don't have to linger there, but even in the theological training we might have received, how this is still a different starting point from that. Like, what does it mean to approach the text with a different frame, if you will?
Yeah. Can you answer it some? I've got some thoughts. I mean, I think it's, well, okay, let me take a first pass. I think it involves, I think the lens that invites us so deeply these days is theologies of liberation, that you start from the place of liberation. And often and I'll just say this, like the critique often of liberation theology is, well, you can't just start with any one body, because if you start with any one body, you neglect conversations about other bodies, which of course is it's literally, that argument can literally be transferred to Black Lives Matter, right? Like, it's the argument against Black Lives Matter, right? That if you start with a particular life, you're going to forget that all lives matter, which the point is that you start from the place of oppression and the place of violence, because if you understand that place, you can work towards freedom from it, right? You have to understand that pain and the center of that violence first. So, I think for us, we're at a place where we really think it matters to start from the place where the violence and oppression is happening, and then let that speak to, let it speak beyond itself in a way.
And I think if we were like to just say directly is like, until you start to look at the text or at life or at the world beyond the frame that was set before you, beyond the framework of understanding who God is and what God looks like, beyond the frame of how I should interpret this text, not keeping in mind that this is from the center of power over and over and over and over again. And so until you can get out to the edges, or to the center of the pain, if you will, or the oppression of the where the harm has been done, I don't think that we can actually hear the text or be set free from the text. And in fact, like, I think the sacred text, what we see in history these days is the ways that the sacred text has been used to harm, like to actually create harm. Like the story of the church isn't one, or the story of religion isn't one where the religion is pure, like that Christianity is pure. It's just been there's some blemishes along the side or whatever. No, it's actually from within the Christian story, within the Christian tradition, within Christian history, that oppression has been like enacted, enforced. And that is certainly with colonialism and slavery, but to the point of the topic tonight in particular as well, it is certainly towards queer bodies. And if I wanted to like press into that a little bit further, I think one of the things that I would say is within the Christian tradition, one of the things that you see happening, and definitely I credit Kelly Brown Douglas for this, but one of the things that you see happen is that there's this, she calls it the Platonization really of Christianity, where body and soul are separated, and one is good and one is bad. And I'll let you have one guess about which one is good and which one is bad. So they say that she makes the argument that it's this separation of ourselves, this separation of body and soul, of everything. Like the soul is the only place of good that can be saved, whereas the body is bad, and with that, sex is bad, bodies are bad, anything you do in your bodies are bad. But what they do is it like breaks open this place for like violence to come in and oppression. And like that is the crack or the wedge through which the theological argument is made for harming bodies. And so I think one of the things when queer people show up at church is like you're in your in-fleshed body. Like it like when you are wrestling with the fact of your queerness, you realize that you can't separate your soul from your body in a way, and it like forces these things to be to no longer accept that breaking apart. And so it's like that kind of work that you can spend your whole life in the center of this frame of power and never get to that understanding. And so I think that's why we think it's super important to look at liberation theologies, to look like obviously Black liberation theology is the parent. You have Latin American liberation theology, you have womanist liberation theology, you have queer liberation theology, and so the story goes. But until you can learn to look from those places, I feel like it becomes really difficult to actually get inside and see and unpack and rehear and relearn and reimagine what is this story, this peaceable kingdom, this moral imagination that we are gathering for in the first place. So I think one of the things that I watched you do, I've had the privilege of getting to hear this sermon before and read it again this afternoon, but like one of the things that I think is so powerful that happens in the sermon that you shared is there's a way in which you flipped who is being saved in the story, or you broadened who is being saved in the story and make the very clear argument that it's queer lives who can invite to salvation in new ways. Will you say a little bit about that move? I mean,
yeah, no, I will. Yeah. So if you think about if we're talking about looking from spaces of liberation, and when we think about the parent of liberation theology being Black liberation theology, and of course someone like James Baldwin is a complex voice in that because he has a complex relationship with faith, right? But I mean, it's James Baldwin who really begins to unpack for the American consciousness that white people don't understand themselves. White people do not understand what it means to be white. They haven't had to think about it, interrogate it, imagine it. They don't know anything. They don't know about themselves, right? And so Baldwin's like, Black people know what it means to be white. We know what it means to be Black, and we know what it means to be white, and we know what it means to be everything in between, because our survival is dependent upon understanding the way in the architecture of this violence and the architecture of these identities. Like, we have to understand it all incisively to survive, much less thrive, right? So, I mean, Baldwin is among others, right, are these brilliant American minds, right, that begin to expose for us, like, no, like, we don't need to spend all this time talking about what Black people do or don't need to do or how to fix racism or not. We need to talk about what white people need to do to understand their souls. Like, their souls and bodies are so detached from each other that they don't even know who they are. Right? Which, you know, of course, now we have modern terms for it, like white fragility and so on and so forth. But these are kind of the early stages of that. So I say all that to say, right, like, it's from spaces of oppression and pain that one has to learn not only oneself, but one's oppressor, if you will, right? The selves, that is the others that are creating the environment that makes you feel like you can't be queer, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that's making queer people feel like they can't be queer, right? Like, that's heteronormativity, that's patriarchy, that's misogyny, that's all, right? There's a lot of stuff happening that makes a queer person go like, I don't think this is gonna work out too well for me, right? So they have to understand themselves, and they have to understand the architecture of the violence imposed upon them, which means they are very incisive, right, about how the world works and about what needs to happen for that world to not cause the violence it's causing. So we got to listen to the people who know the violence and know the pain in order to know how to heal it. So here's the tension I'm pressing into, right, is that I think a lot of times the spaces that churches want to stay in, and there are a million reasons for that, and we can unpack them, but like, churches want to stay in the conversation about, you know, what can we do to make this place more welcoming for people who are LGBTQ plus. Like, it's a great, please keep having that conversation, churches. Don't stop having that. Keep having it. But if you're not having it alongside or more deeply informed by this conversation, and here's this conversation, how the church is a hot mess that's attached to too many systems of violence over the course of its history. And if we want to be anything other than that, if we want to be saved from that, we have to be taught by, we have to be shaped by, we have to sit down and listen to, as though we are students, right, of the disciplines that these our teachers can teach us. That's a different posture. Do you understand what I'm saying? That's a different posture from how do we make sure that our space is more welcoming? Because then your space being more welcoming is just like people kind of feeling like they mostly can be there, hope it goes okay, hope nobody says anything yucky to me, seems to be good. But the posture of learning is I'm pressing the church far. I'm pressing the church far in order to save it.
For its salvation.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to push into one more thing before I invite Scott to join us, and we can open up in dialogue, however, to engage in whatever questions might be coming up for you. But another thing that we've been spending a decent amount of time talking about at this point in time is, like, as we think about our sacred texts and how that can be oppressive, like that we come to our sacred text with an image of God. We bring to the text an image of God. And one of the things that keeps coming up is like how often we bring like this authoritarian, Jackie Lewis's strict father image of God.
Right.
And how that image of God is one where God is primarily like a punisher. And I would even go so far as to say even an abuser. And so I think, we see authoritarianism on the rise. It's something we bring to our sacred text. It is the part that would like squash the fullness of the human being flourishing, the queer body flourishing as well. I don't know if you want to.
I mean, you keep going. I can't. Yes. That figure for God. You just can't get in the water freely if that's who God is. Nobody can. Nobody can get baptized freely if that's who God is. So yeah, I think our image of God gets transposed on. I mean, like, we were talking about the percentage of people. So to talk about our election, we were talking about the percentage of people, somewhere around the 30%-ish, who indicate that they prefer an authoritarian leader.
Or predisposition.
Are predisposed to wanting, and y'all hear what I'm saying, right? Like a whole lot of people want to have an authoritarian leader. And I think a whole lot of people want to have an authoritarian leader because their God is authoritarian. And that's an image of God that desperately needs busting. And again, I definitely think queer folks have lots to say about busting that image of God. Lots.
Yeah. And I think so Jackie Lewis in an interview at a podcast that she did with Richard Rohr and Brian McLaren, I was reading a quote from her today, and they were talking about this notion of image of God and comparing sort of the nurturing parent to the strict father, and the different images that has for us. But one of the things she brings is like, what I would hope for us is a way to shake it up. And I think maybe some of what our queer friends are giving us, the queer world of the non-binary kind of conversations that happen that make us think, oh, well, that animus can be male and female, right? The anima can be male and female. And I think I find some hope in that. I also find some hope in that, like that we can queer this image of God that is like killing us quite literally. And so that's maybe enough for us to
Sure.
sort of like, to like put out there as far as what we're up to. And then Scott, happy to invite you to join in and solicit any questions. That is what we're doing next, right?
Is that right? Okay. We know what's happening.
You definitely know what's happening. We just want to say thank you for what you have just moved us through, the water that you've invited us into. And so I'd like to invite everybody to break the ritual of silent nodding and unmute yourselves and give a rousing cheer for what we've just experienced. It is much deserved. Stop with the golf claps and let's get loud for a second.
That's beautiful. Our cacophony version at Calvary Sunday worship. We usually always do this at coffee hour and not during worship. But if there's ever a happy birthday to sing, we just unmute everybody. And of course it sounds
wild.
Yeah, but
it's fun though.
It's kind of our thing in the pandemic is Zoom happy birthday. It's neither of our birthdays, so you don't have to do that. But just throwing it out there.
We do want to open up for questions, and there are a few ways that we do that. So we want to invite everybody to enter into this discussion, to bring questions and comments to Sally and Maria and Ashton. If you want to raise your hand, you can go to the participants button and raise a hand, and we will try to track who has raised their hand and who wants to ask. So please feel welcome to do that. If you prefer to write a comment or a question in the chat, then we'll be glad to share that. So please feel welcome to do it that way. And if we're missing you and you've got your hand raised and we're not seeing it, it's not on purpose, then please feel welcome to get our attention by waving us down. Let me ask a first question, if I can, just to get us started. So I have a page full of questions, and the second half of your presentation made me scramble because I had written a bunch of questions when Maria was preaching, and then Sally started answering all the questions that I had. And so the question I'm going to ask is the last question that I wrote, and I say all that because it's trying to hold a lot. Okay. You talked about the importance of bodily experience. I would say incarnate experience. And the terrible paradox of losing the incarnation in what you describe as kind of Platonism, an abstraction that becomes violence, and a way of liberation that trusts the experience of the body and listens to it as a way to rediscover truth. So here's the question for you. We've just experienced you preaching and teaching. We've learned from it. We've also experienced it. It was more than intellectual. And it was wonderful to watch you and to experience you do it in yourselves and together. It was like watching two people play music or get hopped up on the music. So this is the question. When you preach and teach like that, what is that like in yourself? Like, what does that feel like? Because it feels really good to be on the receiving end of it. What's that like?
What's that like?
I mean, the word that comes to mind is like a sense of flow, where you stop, you lose a little bit of the conscious, like your inner critic self, and you're like really just present in the moment, in the fullness of your your body and being. I think that there's a lot of work that's been done about flow where you might like lose a little sense of time even, but it's like a full presence, but in a way that, again, like, sort of for me, plenty of times in the day-to-day life, like turning down the voice of the inner critic can be very, very hard. But there are certain moments where you really are like present in the fullness of yourself and set free from that. And so I think that would be one way I might describe it.
Yeah, no, I think it's it's both. It's like you can sort of sit inside yourself and also kind of around yourself in a way. But I think the critique part is the significant one in a way that is just more like it's just allowing it. It sounds repetitive, but it's allowing the experience of the experiential to just be what it is. Like it's certainly a little different on, we're all figuring it out on these platforms, no doubt. But I think the other thing I'd say, Scott, like it just feels like it matters so much. I think that's I think this is why I believe that we really have to listen to people who know experientially the place of pain, harm, violence, because like it's, right? Like this isn't just like interesting conversation for me, right? Like, I mean, it's interesting conversation. I'm interested in all of you and happy to be, right? But like, I don't just sort of finish this and think like, well, that was a like fun conversation, right? Like
fun thought experiment.
Or a fun thought experiment. Yeah. Like I'm thinking, like, is there any edge that's moved a little bit farther for the ones I love who hold a story like mine to get to be a little bit freer? Right? Like, so part of the flow is that it's like, it's attached, right? It's me. It's like,
mm-hmm.
If I can, I would say it feels like more even than moving the edge, just not to underestimate the critical importance of that. What you just offered us felt life generating, life giving, felt like, I mean, it felt like the movement of spirit in the book of Acts, which very often picks people up and moves them to places they didn't know they were going to go. And it felt that way. We do want to open this to everybody, and questions for Sally, Maria, and for Ashton. Description of your grandmother fits that description very well also. And what were you saying?
Ash would like to speak.
Yeah, go.
Yeah, so I was like, I was like this, but I was containing myself while everything was happening and just being a part of this whole experience. But first, I want to say y'all broke it down. So it was all that. And I guess my question is just, as I was listening, I just love how I could take in everything. It was like, I could even hear like music, if there was some music behind, and how you guys were just presenting it. And it was just this poetic piece. And it was like I was there in that moment. And so I wonder, my question, I guess, or what I was thinking is, how has this particular sermon been told to a Black congregation? Like, how have they received this message, in thinking, it's centered around a Black queer, man, what has that been like? Because I think about my grandmother, and if she were to have heard this tonight, she's like old school, like, I don't know what they have done with this Bible here. But it's like, I think it would really make her think. And I loved it. And I can't wait to share it. So yeah, that's what I want to know.
Yeah. So yeah, it was a beautiful day at Calvary, I'd say, is my recollection from this sermon. But Calvary sort of sits at a place where this is the kind of conversation we're having in the way we want to see the church imagined. So there's synergy there in a way, and Calvary's composed of Euro-Americans, Black Americans, African lives, Latinx lives, Asian American lives. So queer across the gamut. Yeah. So for our community, I think it's one that, that deeply resonated. I do know of one professor, a womanist theologian. I think I heard about that. I'm trying to remember her name and trying to remember how we heard. Yeah.
I met her and she was using it in the sermon.
Well, yeah, right. She teaches a class.
She's the one that brought to life Beyonce's gospel mass.
Yeah, right. That's right. Yeah. And so
Yolanda Norton.
Yes. And so Yolanda Norton's class, one of her classes, she has sort of a series, uses a series of sermons. And so, yeah, she told me that day that I guess somehow it had made its way to her and that she used it in the class. And so we talked a little bit about the kind of the role it played in her class. So, I mean, I'm trying to figure out how it is far from lost on me that this would not sit well in most places, which is kind of the whole point. So, yeah.
Well, it's amazing. I loved it. So thank you.
Other questions or comments that folks would like to share for Sally and Maria?
Michelle?
Don't ask a hard one. I'm just kidding.
Not me. I guess kind of pulling on Ashton's question there, and having sort of sat in a seat where I had to sort of confront and begin to listen to my own children, and to begin to learn also about intersectionality and how that all plays into this as well, and to learn from you two in such tremendous ways, and the patience that you had with me and have with me. So I guess I'm wondering what words of wisdom you would have to pastors who would be really afraid to preach that kind of message to their congregations, even if they felt like they believed it themselves. How do you kind of begin to wade into that water? How do you feel like you're going to run after that chariot? How do you help people figure that out?
You
That's the not it sign. No, I'm not going to use this as my definitive answer to the question, but in an essay that we read, or that Maria shared with me this afternoon, that Baldwin wrote, he was talking about whiteness, and it was a collection in a book, maybe there's a collection of essays written by Black people about whiteness. And he asked the question, how did they become white? And Baldwin's answer was this: by opting for safety instead of life. I just sort of lay that there, but then I'll also pull back and be a little bit honest too, right? So Anne and Scott have invited us, or invited me, to a number of these gatherings prior. but because like the site of this is like upstate South Carolina, and that's also the site where like I was growing up with the notions about whether or not it was okay or not to be me. Like there have been a lot of things I have to face down within myself to even show up in the space via Zoom, much less in person. So I also get that. But I think that choosing life isn't without pain, and choosing life isn't without loss, and choosing life isn't, I don't know, without chaos, and it's also like worth it. It's also, do you want to say?
I don't know, like I don't know, maybe a couple of additional, just as I'm reflecting, because I do hear the like source or the heart of the question. I think I do. I'm hoping I do. It's not the posture we sit in, right? So because we wouldn't be hired at the places you're talking, right? So we know that, right? Like we don't sit there, and so we just are where we are, and so we're just gonna have a different conversation, and then hope, that almost like we're in the chariot, right? And so as people hear us reading the scroll, they're like, oh, that's an interesting conversation. I want to hear more about that, right? So we know that that's our kind of, if you will, like that's the story. We can also have to be honest with ourselves about times where that feels frustrating, right? Like, and isolating in its own way, but we don't have to do all that today. But practically, I mean, a couple of thoughts I have for pastors who, or leaders, religious voices who sort of find themselves in a space where maybe like internally their theology is at a place that sort of their external community isn't at. And so what do you do with that dissonance? I do think one, like the importance of kind of clarity around sort of self-talk. And here's what I mean by that. I think you have to say, this place is doing harm by not letting me preach the sermon that I know is right for me to preach. At least to yourself, you have to say that clearly, right? So that I don't know what wilderness road that will take you on, right? Like the path, but it feels like you've at least you've got to start. That's kind of the foundation of moral courage, right? To be able to say, it's weird and not good. It's bad that the things that I feel like I must say for the hope and healing of the world, I don't think I can hear. And I don't think that's my fault. So I just need to say that to myself, right? So I would start there, and then from that kind of grounded place where you're naming to yourself that dissonance, then you kind of see where it ends up taking you, right? So it might be that the next month I got to tell somebody else that, right? I got to tell another person here that. And then it's like, I got to sit down with a group and say that. And then it's like, now it's time for, right? Like that's sort of that's the work and the path, where I think sometimes what I'm saying is I think a religious leader can sort of instead tell themselves, it just kind of is what it is. Like they are who they are. We go, we do what we can. And I understand there are moments in life where maybe we do that just to sort of make it through that season. But I think building a whole life that way will be debilitating for the soul. Mm-hmm. So it's like, do you want your soul to be debilitated for your whole life? Because you just kind of keep saying that. Now, the second part of this that I think is painful is a whole lot of people then eject, right? Like profoundly beautiful voices have ejected from, if you will, American Christendom. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, Michelle, I don't know what to do about that. Like, it's terrible. It is a terrible violence that happens. And I'm going to always wish for better. Was that something like, okay.
Can I follow that with a question? You just named one of the questions, Maria. You illustrate very clearly how the church is attached to systems of violence. That's a wonderful, concise expression of multimillennial thing. So why have you stayed with it?
Do you want to do this in like a spiritual direction session, or do you want to do this on Zoom with everybody? You go, Sally.
He asked you.
Did he? Oh. Oh, Scott. You go first. I'll think of something to say.
Maybe because it is where we gather with our bodies. Or one of the places that we gather with our bodies to do life. And one of the things that we do in church is like, I think chaplaincy really shaped me in this regard, like where like it's about births and baptisms and I don't know, it's about the flesh of sharing life together in some ways. It's like one of the places where we do it, and every so often it's where you actually get to like sort of pull back the veil, or like you get a glimpse behind the veil or all the masks that we've like armored ourselves with, and it's there, I think, where I might have like hope for our transformation, or where why I particularly stay.
It does feel like it feels tied. It was really beautiful to have your poem, your work, Ashton, sort of hold this space, because I think it's where we sing. It's where we can sing together. Of course, I mean that as both particularly and as broadly as you did, as metaphorically, like, which I think is what you're like. It's a space where something like this has potential to happen, right? There's a sense of a shared story. We're attached to them. They roll around in our minds and hearts and souls and bodies, and we want to talk about them together. And in doing that, we get attached to these images that then press us into other images, and like it's a potential path towards soulfulness, towards knowing the soul. But yeah, I mean, Scott, like I would say I live in the borderlands when it comes to the architecture that is the church in the U.S. So I'm okay with that question staying open-ended, that this other thing I'll say. Over the years, I think for me, it's also just been like, you don't get to tell me where I can't be. Right? Like, so that I think that probably has a timeline for my soul, right? Like you can only kind of live so long that way, but there is energy in it, right? There is energy and possibility, I think, for change in it, to say like, because you don't own this, you don't get to say that I don't get to stay. So we're going to keep like going. Yeah, so lots more to say about that. Michelle's looking at me like, that's not gonna last you very long. I know.
Michelle, is your hand raised?
Uh-huh.
Uh-huh.
Sometimes they do tell you you can't stay.
That is correct.
Mhm.
You know, and then I think then we find ourselves continuing to imagine, you know, what is this thing we call church, and who gets to,
Mhm.
so then it's a whole other, like, you don't get to say, right? You don't even get to say what it is.
Well, I think that's the wilderness road. That maybe bears as much fruit as anything else it has for me.
Other questions or comments? Sally, you were about to say something. Maria.
I was mostly just going to tell a funny story about, it's not funny, it's sort of, but like, so that we can laugh about perhaps the violence that does exist. Not, you know what I mean? Let me just tell the story.
Yeah.
But, so one of the things that happened over time from our hire at Calvary is that hire got translated into many languages, kind of across the globe, but not with like, people were not excited about it. They had things to say about it. And we have this couple that is Taiwanese American and came across on some like listserv they were on an article about our hire, and we're like, oh, well, we're going to be moving to DC soon, and that sounds like a great church to go to. So like in a space that was like undeniably like tearing us a new one, right? Like they were like, oh, that place sounds great. They hired those two. Like, we can't wait to go when we move to DC. And they're a, you know, beautiful part of our community. So I told you it was like funny, but not funny. Things like that happen.
Mhm.
Do we get to ask any questions? No, we don't.
You can ask a question.
Well, like, I don't know, how's this going? What do you see happening these days? One of the most significant moral moments in the history of the country. Stuff's going on in South Carolina. What are y'all talking about? What are you stressing about? What are you up to? You gotta read the faces. I can't tell. Yeah. What are you freaking out about? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm trying to read the room.
I will say that, you know, we've talked so much about freedom tonight, that what I am continually bumping up against is that I don't know if people really want to be free. Some people. And so how do you get them to want to do that? To be freely baptized, to believe in a God that is not authoritative and authoritarian. Like, when people want that, how do you get them to not want that?
This is a pretty perpetual conversation at our dinner table. Yeah, no, I think, I think if we're really gonna deeply unpack the effects of the wounds of all the archies and the phobia, like, and white supremacy, like white supremacy and patriarchy married together makes this cocktail of whatever we are, right? Like, yeah, I think you're right to name that, like, lots of people may just say, like, I'm really fine with how things are going for me, and what you're saying sounds like
Hard.
not a lot of fun for me, and so hard pass. I do think that's why I include in this sermon, right, that like there are losses. And that's something that I don't think whiteness teaches well at all. There's a lot of things it doesn't teach well, but it definitely doesn't teach what it means to say, like, wow, we're in such drastically different places that we must part. And the way we tend, I think what definitely can happen even in moderate to sometimes progressive circles is the story that gets told is like, you know, no, you never give up on, you know, and sure, like arguably you never give up on someone's potential for their freedom and their joy. Like that's very true. And sometimes you do give up, right? Because it's time to, because in one sense, and I think about this certainly for Black lives all the time, right? The emotional tax that they're constantly paying in order to just make the world like manageable for them, right? Like at some point, even still, like we have to say for my own sort of healing and wellness, like I have to be done with that. And I don't think that we teach that well. I think we treat that as like a moral failure. Do you see what I'm getting at? Like, yeah, anyway, more to say about that. I don't think it's a moral failure.
The thing that I'm sort of like latched onto for today, I was trying to look for a picture that one of our children, like during Zoom church, drew of.
Where's your phone? I might be able to find it. Keep talking.
Drew of God. We asked them to draw pictures of what God looked like during our service when we were talking about, and one of our kids, whose name was Grady, drew this amazing photo. I'll see if Maria can find it. I couldn't find it quickly.
I don't know. Keep talking.
But nonetheless, the picture, the image was of God was like hold on. There you go. So that's Grady showing it. And you can see that the image of God is like multicolored, male and female. What did she say that he said about it?
God's our mother and father, carrying a shepherd's staff because God shepherds us, and wearing rainbow robes because obviously rainbows.
Yeah. So, I mean, one, wow, that's the image of God that this 7-year-old has. But two, I think that there's probably, I was, again, reading, or I want to go back and listen to it, but Jackie Lewis, Brian McLaren, Richard Rohr having this conversation about how our images of God become fixed by the time we're 6 years old. And whether that image is about, like, basically, unless we're going to do the work to like deconstruct and choose a different way, right? Like, and so our images of God as like a really strict authoritarian father versus image of God as mother, loving parent, or whatever our image of God is. And so that is like really resonating with me today. And in particular, I've latched on to the very, very brief Meister Eckhart poem. How long will grown men and women in this world keep drawing in their coloring books an image of God that makes them sad? How long will grown men and women in this world keep drawing in their coloring books an image of God that makes them sad? So, I mean, I don't know, maybe one more place for us to keep.
And to your question, Al, I'm just checking on the chat here. Yes, I think if I'm reading it correctly, yes, that's pretty much what I'm saying is, or I think that's what I'm saying. Yes. That, I mean, to understand the construct of whiteness, what it is, what it's done, how it's shaped white people, yeah, I mean, you have to listen to how Black voices and lives interpret what whiteness has done and been, in order to understand whiteness. Otherwise, we'll just keep treating it like a neutral thing when it's not.
And a one-off individual thing.
Yeah.
We are right at time. Sally Marie, we want to thank you again. We have looked forward to this for a long time, longer than the series, as Sally has indicated. For more than a couple of years, we've looked forward to this, and it has been well worth the wait. So thank you again so much for giving this time and for giving so much of yourselves to us tonight. Thank you.
Absolutely. Good to be
with
you. Yeah.
You asked, what are we freaking out about here? And I can't speak for everybody else, but I would say we all know this place, and we know the deep history of it, and that there is a lot of work to do, and that can be very despairing. But we also are constantly in circles where people are doing heavy duty work and doing it with real heart. And this gathering week after week, and the people who ask for the recordings because they can't be here at the moment of, that is one of the places where I find a lot of energy and hope. And from what I can tell, those circles are more and more circles and more people in them. So I hope. We have ended every one of these gatherings with a benediction in music from Shelton Ridge Love. And we are going to enjoy that again tonight. Shelton is going to be our concluding word. This will be our benediction. And then we will say thank you and good night. We have one more session next week, and it is an experience of worship designed by our presenters. And so we want to urge you to join us again next week for our concluding session, when our presenters pull their combined strength together to offer us an experience. If today has been a beginning of that, I cannot wait for next Tuesday night. Shelton.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Maria, Sally, Ashton, Shelton, thank you for pulling us in tonight. Thank you, everybody, for giving the time and for creating this for many, many more people who aren't here. Thank you. We'll see you next week. Good night, everybody.